Hey guys, what's up? So today I'm going to show you the recording of a webinar I did for Microsoft back in 2020. And on this call, about 100 companies from all over the Microsoft ecosystem, all of their ISVs, independent software vendors attended. It was the second part of a three-part webinar series where the first part was from on-prem to cloud. So how do you transition an on-prem tech solution to a cloud SaaS solution? Where this one was on product packaging. So how do you package product into modules and tiers and add-ons and so forth? And really, I have some core design concepts that I'm going through that I'm going to share with you. And then the last one was on pricing models. But just to give you the highlights, sort of the introduction to the talk today, so you can decide whether you want to spend the 2 hours actually watching it. So I go through 4 main concepts in this presentation. The first one is one of fencing. So fencing is essentially segmenting your customers into groups that are so different that they need different product packaging and pricing. So one of the examples I use in the talk is an edtech company that sells to universities and then to professors. And they are so different types of customers that universities need, different product interfaces and dashboards and modules and tiers and pricing compared to professors that needs other packaging and pricing. So if you have these kinds of differences in your customer user base, you should realize it and fence your customers accordingly. The second concept that I go through in packaging design is job to be done. And that is essentially figuring out where the sources of demand are in your marketplace and then packaging around those. And it's a really powerful concept in building value propositions that work in terms of that they sell. So it's one of my sort of most key concepts that I keep insisting on spending time on with clients and that most people miss, because a lot of people assume that a problem is worth money, and it's not. A job is a problem that also has demand chasing it. And so the difference is crucial, but key when you're trying to package something. So I go through this quite a bit. The third thing is what I in this presentation called bottom-upping, but essentially it's just quantitative research. Like, how do you do quantitative research on features? How do you run surveys? What do you listen for in terms of actually building up the actual sort of feature stack within a tiered model or a module and so forth? So I give a few examples of how that can be run, what kind of sort of outputs you should aim for in terms of sort of Sankey diagrams and so forth. And there's some inspiration there. It's a little bit fast in order to so don't expect like a full how-to breakdown, but expect like, okay, so these are the main sort of directions that I can push quantitative research in if I want to do that to drive packaging. Then the fourth concept that I go through is laddering. So how you design a product packaging structure that actually is built for expansion. And that is actually sort of going back to the demand concept, the jobs concept, where we say, okay, so what kind of customer journey do we have where customers enter into our product, start using it, and then what are we selling them next? And that is what I call laddering, where you essentially build your product packaging in a way that allows the customer to expand their functionality usage with you over time. And I usually run this on themes, on narratives, or axes. And finding that axis for your product can be a real good driver for your sales and your customer success teams in helping drive expansion sales. So those are the 4 concepts: the fencing, the job to be done, the bottom-upping or quantitative research of features into packages, and finally the laddering or structuring of expansion axes within your product. And with that, that is some of the key tools in my packaging toolbox, and I go into at least some depth in them in this presentation. Now, I will also say that, as always, I get smarter too when working with clients and helping them out. So maybe I don't think any of the concepts in this presentation are wrong, but I think I've managed to refine it somehow and make it a little sort of tighter and cleaner in the years since this presentation. But it should still bring some value to you, and it is sort of pretty comprehensive. So if you are working with product packaging, I hope you enjoy it and that it gives you something. All right, Cheers. Take care.
Welcome everyone to this third webinar in the sort of SaaS B2B pricing, let's say, 3 workshop stretch. And the last sort of topic that we have today is packaging. The previous 2 ones, I know most of you attended those as well, but just to mention it, the first one was on the transitioning process and phasing of going from an on-prem to cloud. And the second workshop, the one we had last Thursday, was on pricing models and specifically also on pricing architecture, on how to sort of fitting the pricing to the customers' sub-budgets and internal stakeholders. So one of the assumptions I made Thursday was for all the pricing models to work, essentially we have to assume that the product packaging is already in place. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I have this agenda for us for the next 2 hours. And as I've done the past 2 times, I'll pause after each one. Maybe I'll pause one more time during this to allow you to ask questions. So if you have a question, simply write it up and write it in the chat. And once I'll do the pause, I'll sort of read back through the questions that have been posed, and I'll read them out loud, and then I'll try and answer them as best as I can. And also, I know quite a few of you actually have contacted me on my email and asked me questions there that are, let's say, specific to your business or in other ways, maybe not appropriate for sort of a webinar style like this. And I really appreciate that. And if you're sitting with a question like that and you haven't written me yet, you're very welcome to do so. I'll try and answer as quickly as I can. Or if the situation is a little bit more complex, I'll just simply invite you to do a quick call with me and we can just discuss it there. Okay, so, but the agenda for today is to first look at how we build value propositions. And I have a few, especially 3 design concepts that I want to present to you in this respect. Then I want to talk about how we can design the product to facilitate the expansion journey or the expansion sales that our customer will have. There is a single design concept in here that sort of builds upon the 3 other ones that we have in the value proposition. Then I want to talk about what happens since your product isn't static, since you develop new features or you improve upon existing ones, or maybe you find out that the packaging you have, you need to redo that. Maybe there's an upside in that. So how do you change your product packaging over time, especially as you have to change prices over time? How is this? What kind of thinking do you have to run in order to, let's say, do this properly? And what kind of structures do you have in terms of price increases, contract framework, and so on in order to do this? And I'll repeat the argument that it's one of the major upside potentials that you have in your growth, basically. Lastly, I'll look at a few customer cases. That's going to be customer cases all the way through, but they're on a more, let's say, specific tool basis. But at the end, with the pricing project template, I'll show you sort of a rough template of how a project could look. And I'll show you sort of 2 cases where I have I have explicit, permission to talk a little bit more deeply about them. So I'll sort of tell you what the problem was and how we solved it and what the result was. And if you have questions for them, we can answer those too. But essentially, it's just to sort of showcase sort of the kind of work and the kind of impact that we get out of these processes. And we'll end with questions as well. Okay. So far so good. So let's start. First on building the value proposition. So I said that I'm going to use 3 design concepts to do this. And then when we talk about the expansion journey, there's going to be a 4th design concept. And essentially I put all 4 in here. So the 3 design concepts that we use to create value propositions are fencing, jobs to be done, and what I call bottom-upping. And then the one we use to design the expansion journey is called laddering. So essentially, if we pull back a little bit, what we're using these design concepts for is essentially to sort of figure out what kind of, well, how we sell the product. What actually is, what are we pushing sort of across the desk and saying, please buy this? Is it everything that we have done, all of the features that we have developed, all of the services? Or is it a subset where we say, well, you have maybe a smaller package here, and maybe you have an advanced over here. So maybe they build upon each other. Maybe we design our product to be modularized. So we say, well, we have modules. Maybe we have them as add-ons. Maybe we have a full feature toggle. So we say, well, we have 200 features and you choose which ones are right for you. And we essentially sort of design a specific project for you. And so each of these options have several benefits and drawbacks. And what we're trying to do with packaging is essentially to figure out how to take all we've got, all the features, all the technical features, all the technical capabilities, all the potential services we could offer inside all of the potential, let's say, commercial structures, deal terms, terms and conditions, so on, for payment terms, and essentially say, well, which of these, if put together, will yield the best results for us, given our strategy? But which of these, if put together, will yield the best results for us? So essentially, you could look a little bit about so what is going on here, and it could be something like, well, imagine that you're a McDonald's and you're selling, and that each of your products is like an individual feature. So maybe you have the feature of the Big Mac, and maybe you have the feature of the cheeseburger, and maybe you have the feature of French fries, and that comes in 3 different settings, small, medium, and large, and so on and so forth. And you have sodas and donuts and coffee and all of the other, actually literally hundreds of products that you can get at McDonald's. And you want to figure out, okay, so who's buying what? What are the customers interested in? And you might, if you just offered all of them for sale and said, well, this is a sort of, we're not putting any boundaries in place, so just come into the store and buy whatever you want. And then maybe after a while you figure out, well, it seems like donuts and coffee are being sold together an awful lot, right? So there's a particular customer choice, donuts and coffee, that seems to be superior compared to other customer choices. So maybe coffee and burgers aren't sold that much together. So just say, okay, donuts and coffee seems to be like there's some sort of correlation between these 2 features. So what happened if we created a menu? We created a donut coffee menu, and we said, well, coffee is whatever, €2, and a donut is €1, and maybe you can get both of them together for €3. That might be one version, but maybe we give a discount and we say, well, we know you like this, we've seen it, so we're going to offer this for €2.50. And now you create a little menu. And then maybe what happens is that you say, well, how about we don't sell coffee and donuts as individual items, but we only sell the menu. And this is sort of somewhere in this, let's say, set of options, there is, one of them is going to give you better revenue or better, let's say, relationship between your sales costs, your marketing costs, and the revenue and profits that you generate. And that's essentially what packaging is about. It's just sort of figuring out, we can do donuts and coffee and fries and burgers and so on and so forth, but what should be on the menu? That's sort of the core question that we're trying to answer. So we're using these 4 principles to sort of kick us off. And the first core design, well, let's go through them all 4 at a time. So here's essentially just my fast definition of each 4 of them. So essentially, the first one, fencing, is essentially value-based segmentation. It's how to put your customers into discrete, which means separated, non-overlapping product and pricing schemes to better deliver and extract value. So it's a 2-way street. So fencing is about, or value-based segmentation is about creating a basis for yourself where you're better able to package your product so that you can deliver value, but that also gives you a better base for you to extract value through pricing. That's the first concept. The second concept, jobs or jobs to be done, is essentially a problem that a customer is actively looking to solve with money. So it isn't just a problem, it's a problem with demand attached to it. So there's lots of problems in the world, not all of them have demand or money attached to them. And we need to distinguish between the two. Then there is what I call bottom-upping, which is essentially the process of bundling the individual features into value proposition formed around well-defined jobs. So it's essentially saying, well, we have 200 features and we define them in this and this way. And now we figure out how to actually attach them or relate them to the problems that the customers have that they're actually actively looking to solve with money. So you can also talk about a, let's say, breaking down, building up process in bottom-upping. Essentially, you break it down and then you build it from the bottom up. And then lastly, laddering. That's the ordering of jobs inside a fence through bottom-upping to maximize the customer's profitability across the customer's lifetime. So the relationship between profits that you get from a customer and the cost to get that customer through the door. Okay, so those are the four. And I'll showcase each of them a little bit. And see. So I noticed that some of you haven't muted yourself, so please do that. Okay, so first, fencing. So the characteristics of fencing are, it must be clearly definable by both you and your customers. So classic fences are something like, well, on-prem versus cloud, for example. Your customers are pretty clearly aware that you can't have both, and you're either one or the other. And if you have one product and pricing category for on-prem and one product and pricing category for cloud, that's likely going to be accepted. Another very common fencing structure is, for example, selling to for-profit businesses and selling to governments and selling to education, or selling through, let's say, the sectors, so public, civic, private, or any version thereof where you're saying, well, at least an organization is aware and sort of it is immediately determinable whether they are, let's say, a for-profit company or whether they are not, or whether they are an NGO or whether they are a government or maybe even a private individual. So that could be another form of fencing. Another form of fencing could simply be something like the specific company type if you're selling into some very specific verticals. So it could be retail banks versus investment banks, for example. And there might be overlaps, but usually, depending on your product, that might, if you're using that fence, that shouldn't be a problem. So it must be clearly definable by both you and your customer. Second characteristic is that it must be unjumpable. So a government never converts into a private company, and vice versa. Well, you may convert an on-prem solution into a cloud solution, but when you do, you usually change the entire product category and you change the pricing model. So you're changing that there with, let's say, with the customer's approval as well. So this means, for example, that a fence that isn't working very well is sort of, for example, small, medium, large companies. Because first of all, it's not clearly definable. And even if you define it very clearly, let's say, well, a large company is any company with 1,000 employees or more, then obviously you can have a medium-sized company crossing that line, going from, well, 999 employees to 1,005, and suddenly they have jumped the fence. Or you can have a large company that scales down and, let's say, crosses the other way. This is going to spell a lot of problems for you if you have organized your product and your pricing models around these fences. So make the fences unjumpable. For these reasons, it should not in all cases, but in most cases. So it's a rule of thumb to say, well, good fencing usually can stand the light of day. So let's say that you're selling to public, civic, private, and you should be able to tell all your public, civic, and private customers that that is how you have divided your product schemes and your pricing schemes. You say, well, private companies pay maybe index 100 and governments pay maybe something entirely different because the product has to be adjusted to the different needs for government. And maybe civic companies pay less than the private ones because well, they are in it for the cause and not for the profit. So, and this will usually be acceptable by all of those customers in each of the fences, which enables you to actually implement this segmentation without, let's say, friction or conflict. And the last characteristic is sort of a rule of thumb, is that you might be able to envision a fence, but if it doesn't come with let's say a 30% increase in the ratio or the contrast between customer lifetime value over customer acquisition cost, so CLTV versus CAC, customer acquisition cost, then it's probably not worth the effort, right? So you might call the first rule of thumb is that it should be so easily explainable and definable that it doesn't feel contrived or awkward, that you're not trying to convince someone that there's a fence. It's sort of, if you mention it's sort of relatively obvious what you mean, and people consider it immediately to be fair. And the second rule of thumb is that it should be profitable for you and make sense for you to do so. And it can make sense for you because you can increase pricing in one fence, but it actually can also make sense through the customer acquisition cost insofar that maybe pricing is relatively the same, but if you make adjustments to the product in each of the fences so that they're just easier to sell, then maybe the lowered acquisition costs that you get from creating the fencing is what's driving the value for you. So it's one of the, let's say, the first things that you should do when you're trying to package the product. And it's one of the things that many companies do already. But if you have a clear opportunity to do fencing, you should definitely look into it. So, and well, the last thing is just a note that fencing is also a term in, let's say, classic revenue management, and I'm using it a little bit differently. So if some of you out there are revenue managers and you're saying, well, you clearly got the concept wrong, I know that I use it somewhat different. And if you're Googling fencing pricing, then you're likely going to get a lot of results that are sort of on this, but seems a little bit different. So let me show you a couple of examples of fencing. So this first one is an ed tech company. Their growth stage, which means they're growing quickly, but still losing quite a bit of money. And what they do is they have a product where it allows university students to grade each other's papers and assignments instead of the professor having to do so. And obviously the customer for this product, the main customer, is the institution, the university. But they have created fencing up here at the top where they have specific product packaging and pricing for the instructors or the professors, for the universities, and for the for-profit businesses. So the reasoning behind this is, well, they have a specific product for the professors because the professors essentially get the product for free, which helps them sell to the universities. So the fencing here actually lowers the acquisition cost because it essentially allows them to very clearly define someone that gets it for free and someone that has to pay. So it's sort of an easier way for them to create a freemium without running some of the risks that a freemium would do. And then what the corporate plan here does is it showcases a slightly different product, but also at a much higher price, which shows the universities that they are already getting a substantial discount compared to, let's say, a for-profit environment, which is necessary when you want to sell to especially American universities. So here the fencing actually showcases both a pricing increase in, let's say, some different fences, and it also showcases a lowered acquisition cost, and what is the main customer here, which is the universities. So it's just to explain what is the functionality of having these fences. Let's give another example. Here we have a mock-up for a pricing model for an AI platform for financial services, and it is fenced here at the very top. Insurance companies have one model and one pricing, and banks have another. So it sort of is the first thing that you should do. And it's so sometimes value-based segments are, people talk about them like customer personas, and it's sort of, well, it's this sort of business with these sorts of characteristics and so on and so forth. And I would, that kind of, let's say, segmentation, I would put elsewhere in the product packaging. I would put it elsewhere also in the pricing mechanism. I think fencing is sort of the very big, let's say, red lines that you put down through the middle of your product and say, well, you know, this is one half of our customers and this is the other one. And you get to run all your analysis and your acquisition costs and your development and so on and so forth within each of them. And of course, you might have some, let's say, scaling opportunities on a, let's say, organizational level by maintaining these two fences. But overall, they don't cross and they don't influence each other that much. Okay. So that's the first concept. And it's also, if you have an easy way of doing it, it's also the most important one, because if you have something that can give you a sort of a 30% upside across these fences, it's sort of the right thing to do. Second concepts is jobs to be done. And the first thing I should mention is that this isn't our concept. This is a concept developed by Professor Clayton Christensen. Well, formerly, he actually just died early this year. He was a professor at Harvard Business School. Formerly, he was a partner at McKinsey & Company. And he's also the originator and sort of the father of the whole disruption term. So he has been the sort of the primary thinker on innovation and disruption in the past, I'd say, 2 or 3 decades. And I think one of the concepts that he's developed that hasn't received enough attention is the concept of jobs to be done. And essentially, a job to be done is, well, I called it a problem that a customer is actively looking to solve with money. And I think the first thing to notice is that, at least in Clayton's terminology, problems seem to be relatively stable over time. So a problem is something like getting from A to B, or hiring people, or something else. And over time, there might be different solutions to how you do that. And there might even, with technology and increased complexity in society, appear new jobs that are then relatively stable for a long time. And lots of new services and technology and products arrive at the marketplace to try and solve these jobs. So it's not looking at a specific product category that you get at a job, but you look sort of at what customers are doing to get something done. And the second thing that you should notice is that a problem isn't enough. There needs to be a specific demand for it. And I've sort of divided into 2 types of demand. First is that the customers that you're trying to target are actually spending effort, so time and resources, maybe other than money, in order to solve something. And it might be something as simple as, let's say, a factory floor running specific kinds of work shifts in order to optimize productivity, something like that. But they might also actually spend money on doing this, and they might have a particular piece of software that helps them organize these work shifts. So they might have a punch card machine, or they might have a manager hired to do it, or something else. So it's sort of this combination of customers trying to solve something. And essentially, this is sort of where you can come in with your product and say, well, we solve it better, or we have an alternative solution or an alternative candidate for this job. And I want to show you sort of, let's say, an example of how product packaging doesn't fit this bill, and then how we can sort of turn it a little bit so that it fits this bill. And this was actually a workshop I did yesterday with a large German OEM, original equipment manufacturer, that are creating logistics systems for logistics facilities. And they're global. They have, well, they have over 1,000 installations of these large-scale logistics facilities worldwide, and they have sort of a combination of hardware and software and services and so on and so forth on top of these things. And they are bringing now a specific data analytics product that it has to be cloud-based to the market. And I talked to this engineering department that was responsible for taking this product to market, and obviously they had, you know, being engineers and being German, they'd done a lot of thinking about the customer's use case and how their customers were using data now. And obviously what happened was that a lot of their customers, which would be, for example, large logistics warehouses, they would try to gather their data, and they would then have someone hired to put this data into an Excel sheet, and that Excel sheet would then travel to first the mid-level manager, and then it would be compiled with other Excel sheets, and then it would sort of travel up the chain up to the CEO and eventually to the boardroom. And by the time it got to the boardroom or to the CEO, it would be far too old to act upon. And also, there would have crept in so much error and so many, let's say, different ways of collecting the data that they would be almost useless. So instead what they would do, they'll say, well, we're going to essentially pull all the data out of the machines. We're going to do it real time, and we're going to send it to the cloud, and then we're going to send it to your dashboard that we create on a web app, and you can get access to this, and it will allow you to do, well, a lot of the things that you'd want to do as a logistics facility. So you'd want to do predictive maintenance, so ensure that the installations and the machines and the systems are working, and that you maintain them cost effectively to reduce your, let's say, long-term total cost of ownership. But also you'd want to optimize the operational aspects, the throughput, let's say the productivity of the facility. And obviously you also want to better manage all of that by essentially create scenarios and do period comparisons and so on and so forth. And what the engineers had come up with was essentially this relatively classic way of laying out the stages of what machine learning and AI can do. So essentially, from a data analytics perspective, what data analytics does first is to just describe what's going on. So we get all the data in and we say, so this is what's going on real time in your installation. Then it progresses to diagnose, which is an understanding of why what is happening is happening. Then it starts to predict what will happen next. And finally, given that you can set specific desirable outcomes, it can tell you how to arrive at those outcomes. So what to do in order to, let's say, optimize your throughput or minimize your maintenance or your downtime or whatever it is that you want. So when we're looking at a packaging like this, essentially what this German OEM was thinking, well, a lot of our customers isn't very sophisticated, so we'll just essentially start describing what's going on to them, and then we'll help them over time expanding their, let's say, appreciation of data analytics. And they'll then buy diagnose, and we can then get them to buy the predict package and the prescribe package and so on and so forth. And don't worry too much about the pricing at the bottom. It's just a placeholder. So essentially this kind of packaging, it tells you, okay, so this is our hypothesis of what the customer actually wants to buy. But also it's the hypothesis of how the customer is going to expand and buy more and more of the product over time. And of course you can ask yourself, well, first, does the customer actually want to buy this? And secondly, when the customer has bought, let's say the first package, are they then going to want to buy the next package? And we talked about this for a little while, and I essentially sort of, we created an overview, something like this. And essentially is that they have these 3 levels of the organization where they're delivering value. So they're delivering value to the maintenance level, to the operations level, and to the management level. So they're doing predictive maintenance and reducing costs on capital expenditures, yeah. And they're improving operations, so decreasing operational costs and so on. But what the customer had found out, or what the German OEM had found out, was that, well, maybe they want maintenance a lot, but maybe they don't want operations a lot. So maybe the customer is sort of more advanced on one of these 3, let's say, organizational frameworks than another. So maybe we should, instead of having these sort of 4 brackets in our product, maybe we should just essentially allow the customer to pick anything that they'd like, right? So maybe we should allow the customer to say go predict on maintenance and describe on operations and prescribe on management. And they were thinking about this, and essentially this is McDonald's taking their burger menus and saying, well, let's just sell them, give them a choice of burger and a choice of fries and a choice of soda, but we're not going to bundle it together. Essentially, we're just going to make it a sort of a free, choose what you like style menu, instead of having made prior decisions about what to bundle and how to, let's say, form the value propositions and pre-form the choices for the customer. The problem with this is, one, it's a long sales cycle. You need to explain all of these, in this instance, 12 steps. And you might also want to spend time talking to the customer about all the combinations of steps. And, even for something like this, you have 4 to the 3rd degree. So you have, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 different combinations of maintenance, operations, and management in a product like this. And if you then add a few add-ons that you can put on, as these, they had like digital twins and stuff like that, then very quickly we get into thousands of different potential product deliveries to the customers. So essentially we have now more product options than we have customers. So I asked them, well, is that what you want to do? Do you want to have all these options in your product? And they maybe not. Let's say if we can come up with an alternative that actually solves this problem. So how would we do that? And essentially, we should go back to the idea of the job to be done. So what is it that the customer is trying to do? Is the customer trying to describe something or predict something? Well, maybe, but that something is relatively specific. And my argument with this case is that something actually goes across. So that something is the maintenance or the operations and the management. So instead of having, let's say, a product packaging that looks something like this, instead we'll have a product packaging that looks something like this. So we'll just sell them everything in maintenance. And essentially what we're doing is we're riding on the idea that all of their customers, the first thing that they wanted when they were talking about data analytics was, oh, well, we want predictive maintenance in the future, and stoppages in these logistics facilities is very, very expensive. So even before we start doing operational optimization, we need to make sure that the system works. Just, that the machine starts when we press the button. So, and that requires predictive maintenance. So essentially what we're doing is we're saying, okay, so let's start there. Let's say you buy maintenance, and that's essentially what we're going to sell you in one package. And then we're going to sell it to you with all of the levels that we have, all the way through describe, through prescribe. So all the technical levels that we have. And we'll find out how, through our pricing model, to get at the value differentiations that are within the specific tier. Because what's important here is that it's on the maintenance part that you have demand. this is what's going to be easier for your sales force to actually put on a table in front of a customer and say, you know what, we have created data analytics, and in this package, you get maintenance. With everything that you'd want in maintenance, we get that. And the customer can then say, well, how much am I spending on maintenance? Which is a far easier question than how much am I spending on not being able to properly describe what is going on in my business. That is abstract. Maintenance, they have a clear idea in their P&L on what that costs them. The same for operations, the same perhaps for management. So the idea is that by refocusing your product around a specific job, what you're getting at is also a specific, let's say, budget or expenditure or perceived cost that the customer is already losing or spending in order to solve this problem. And by doing so, you enable your product to be in a position to essentially take over that cost or that budget from the customer, and that is where your pricing power comes from. So it's sort of one of the harder conceptual steps to make when you're doing packaging, because one of the elements of doing this is that if you invent something that is really advanced and sophisticated and was very costly for you to invent or develop, then you don't necessarily put it in a new, very highly sophisticated and expensive module or tier. The new feature that you just spent 6 months and 25 engineers developing might be placed in your freemium version. It might be something you give away. If whatever your freemium job is, it fits there. So this is one of the, let's say, essential dynamics of how your product packaging is going to enable itself to be sold much more easily. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about in the laddering part how we facilitate the upsells, so going from maintenance to operations, but I essentially want to save that bit to when we get to there. So fencing, that's the first concept. Second concept, jobs to be done. Take your features and your product packages and sort them around problems where the customer has existing and explicit demand. Okay, next concept, bottom-upping. So the bottom-upping is essentially to sort of figure out, okay, so what features actually goes into this maintenance tier and what goes into the operations tier. We have this dashboard, where does it go? In this, that, or the other place. And if we have an optionality of developing, let's say, 20 new features, which of them should we develop and how would they fit into this schema? So we call it, or well, I call it bottom-upping. And essentially, it's the process of bundling individual features into value propositions formed around well-defined jobs. And you can sort of consider the jobs to be done like the top-downing, where you say, well, we have these overall conceptual problems, well, not real problems that we've conceptualized that the customer wants to solve. And then the bottom-upping process is then saying, okay, so of everything that we can do, how do we best meet this job? So you can also consider bottom-upping us on say, how do we write the job application for that job that the customer is hiring for? Okay, so these are the steps. First, you take everything you can do from a technical level, service level, even in your, let's say, deal-making capabilities, and you deconstruct that into, let's call it, possible features. Then you go through and analyze each of these features. You describe them. I'll show you, let's say, a methodology for doing that. And then you map those features, or you map your customers' preferences for those features. So which of the features do they prefer together? Coffee and donuts. Which of the features don't they prefer together? Coffee and burgers. And which of the features have a presumably high value or low value for which customers? That might also, especially across segments and especially across, let's say, customer size and, let's say, the customer's level of technological sophistication, vary quite a bit. So you map that. Then you build hypotheses, value propositions. So you say, okay, we have these jobs to be done in this given fence. Now we put features into each job, and that's our hypothesis. Then you take that hypothesis, and you validate it with your customers. You say, well, how do you like that? And if they like it, then you can implement it. If they don't, or if they have some feedback for you that you think is valuable, you essentially repeat steps 3, 4, and 5 again until you're happy. That's the process. Okay, I want to show you a case on how to do this. And I think for some of you who were at my presentation or webinar in November, you've seen parts of this case before, but there are some few extra details now because I expanded a bit on it for today. That so pay attention even if you believe that you've seen it before. So it's a small case, like it's a startup case, but it's interesting because it follows, let's say, this stepwise framework very well. So let's go through it. So Icon Finder is a website that sells icons. So icons are these little sort of graphical images. So let's say you have an icon of a doctor or a bicycle or whatever it is, and you can use them in graphical materials and websites or posters or in mobile apps or whatever it is that you need icons for. So it's a little bit like stock photos or these sort of similar concepts. So they have the largest database in the world, 3-4 million icons that are being sourced from designers all over, and they pay commission to these designers whenever they sell an icon. And they started the business with venture capital from the essentially pre-backed by some venture funds and part of some Danish growth funds, so governmental growth funds. And they've been running at it for 8 years or so. And they have burned something around 3 million, 4 million euros in venture capital. And when I started working with them in 2018, they had a hard time raising the next round. And Martin, who was the founder, he still had a majority stake in the business, but the next round would remove that majority. And he had a pretty clear idea that if he raised that next round, he would be fired from his own business. And the problem was that they just couldn't break even. They were losing customers as fast as they could get them through the door. And they had this kind of packaging and pricing going on. So essentially they had 2 pricing models. They had a pay-as-you-go, which essentially is you essentially upload some money and then you can download some icons in just a purely transactional basis. And then they had these 3 different subscriptions, $9, $19, and $49. And the only real difference was that you could download more or less icons with each of these. Okay, so from a packaging perspective, there is no differentiation between any of these products. So as soon as I've paid, I have the same kind of product experience going to the website. It's the same icons, it's the same search function, it's the same icon editor, it's the same chat support, it's the same tie-in periods and payment terms, and so on and so forth. Everything is the same. So the first thing we did with Icon Finder was we said, okay, let's take an inventory and take a look at how we can actually feature differentiate this. So we might be able to sort of split the product in a way where we can actually create different experiences for different customers, and that might provide us with some pricing power that we can then apply to the market. So the way we do something like that is to first look beyond the mere functional features. So we say, okay, so the functional features are obviously important. So that might be 3 million icons and so on and so forth. But we also have, or an icon editor, but we also have the service features, which are all the things that the organization does to help me use the functional features. And lastly, we have transactional features, which are, well, here I've called it, how will you help me buy it? But it can be tie-in periods and many other things. And essentially, I'll sort of show you what we came up with. This is sort of one of the lists that we came up with. Icon Finder, which is essentially saying, okay, so we have quite a few functional features, and we had many more than these. We have some service features, which essentially are different levels of support and different channels for support. And then we had some transactional features, such as tie-in periods and rollover icon credits. So the rollover credits were the fact, so if you subscribe to 10 credits and only used 5, when the next subscription a month came, you would just be reset to 10. The 5 icons that you didn't download, you just lose. And we had a hypothesis that customers didn't like this, so we asked them, and so on and so forth. And actually, the rollover credits turned out to be the critical feature in this entire feature set that it essentially ended up sort of saving the day for them. There were others as well. But the real process with compiling this inventory of features actually is in opening your eyes and ears and asking around the organization. And the reason I'm sort of paraphrasing in that sort of rather vague way is that in most of the software companies, from startups to enterprises where I come, there's a very high degree of focus on the functional features. So what's happening is that the product team will focus on these, the engineering team will focus on these, the sales team will to some degree focus on the transactional features, but at least there is no clear idea about how the two sets of features should maybe cooperate to create better value for the customers. And sales doesn't own the job of coming up with new transactional features and seeing how that could impact the value proposition, because many transactional features will change the business model in some way. Service features often is owned by a completely third department, so services, customer success, and so on, and might even be distributed across several types of departments. So customer service and professional services might be different in many companies. And so the job here is for you to take the customer's perspective and start looking at what might be valuable, get an inventory of this, and start looking. And I'm going to show you just an example of a customer case I did for a growth company here in Copenhagen, where it was a chance discovery of two features, a service feature and a transactional feature that really helped them turn their entire sales model around. And so I worked for a company called Tamed at Events. They provide event management software. And we had done a pricing process together and repackaged the product and came up with a pricing model, and all that seemed to work. And we had done this for profit businesses, but they also had non-profit customers. And at the very end of the project, the CEO, Yasenko, sends me this email that he got from a customer he was trying to sell to. So this was a US-based NGO that he had approached. I said, well, we have the software, would you like to buy it? And they had then sent him this email back. And it's pretty dense, but I'll highlight the parts that you should note. So essentially, the procurement person in the customer company sends Yasenko this email and says, thank you for talking. We have another software right now that does what your software does. And it has this feature where our boss gets to send out email announcements to all our customers. And he really likes that. So that's a functional feature. So the customer is telling Yasenko, we really need this email functionality because the CEO likes it. And if you don't have that, it's unlikely that we'll buy from you. So that's sort of the first clue that we get. The second clue here is that, well, if we were to buy your software, we have a lot of potential costs associated with shifting. So how do we solve that? And also, they say it again, we have decades of history stored in the current platform. Oh, and by the way, we just signed a 2-year contract with this competitor software. So, maybe it'll take you a couple of years before you can even sell to us. And by the way, we're paying these other guys $8,000 a year. So maybe you want to be cheaper than that. So what do you do about this? And the problem with this is you've just spent acquisition cost. You spent time and money reaching out to this prospect. And essentially they're telling you back, well, we want to be able to sell emails. And what else? 2 other things. We want you to be able to help us migrate to your software, or we can't, or we're not going to buy it because it's just too much work. And finally, since we're already lodged with this competitor of yours for 2 years, maybe we don't want to pay in the meantime. So essentially we get creative and we come up with a feature that we called Eat the Overlap, where we say, well, we're going to offer our software for free during the period in which you have this vendor, this other vendor, or you're committed to this other vendor, but we're then going to take some credit card fees, and we're going to take all the professional services and other sort of direct costs, and we're actually going to charge that. But let's say the entire value-based fee that we could charge for our software, we're going to relinquish that. And when they presented the customer with these two options, saying, hey, we're going to migrate everything for you and we're going to eat the overlap, they bought. And it was these two features that enabled them to actually get at all the customers that had pre-lodged with some of these older vendors or providers. So it's just an example of how you have to mine different parts of your organizations for feedback from customers like this, or go ask the customers and actually come up with ideas for features, especially in the services and the transactional departments. Then we usually run, internally we call it an ontology, but essentially it's sort of a methodological description of the features. So we run them on different, let's say, types of whether or not they're discrete and how the demand is usually present in the market for these. And the only thing that I really want to let's say point to in this is actually this one, which I call the motivation type. And essentially it's distinguishing whether a given feature is actually something that the customer has an active demand for, it's like something that they would really want, or if it's a feature that there is no inherent demand for, but it could block the sale. So this could be something like encryption. So nobody buys software because it has encryption. Well, a few software are bought because of that, but most software isn't bought because it has encryption. But it might block you from buying a particular software if your compliance department says, well, if it doesn't have this level of security, we can't buy it. So this is we're essentially separating features into whether or not they are motivational features or whether or not they are call them hygiene features, which is sort of a really neat way for you to start sort of figuring out how you can use features to actually let's say either develop features that will allow some customers to buy because they couldn't before, or develop features that will actually promote demand for a given type of package. So once we've done this, so we've created the inventory, now we've created the description of features, now we run into mapping customer preferences. And essentially there are two ways to do it. There's the, let's say, traditional gold standard that's been done for past 40 years by pricing consultant, which is essentially running some form of survey, usually a discrete choice analysis survey. This could be a conjoint analysis or MACSDIF analysis. The example here is a MACSDIF analysis, which is what we used with Icon Finder. Essentially, you give the customer a specific set of features, and you ask which one they most prefer, which one they least prefer, and then you reshuffle the features and ask the question again. And for Icon Finder, they had an email database of around 2 million subscribers, so it was very easy for us to run these kinds of surveys on it. But the new gold standard that is actually emerging is to run essentially an AI process on different stacks of data, transactional data, users data, CRM data. And this starts to be especially valuable when you have, let's say, 100 or a few hundred customers, but you have relatively deep data on these. So this is sort of something that we often use with higher revenue customers in a B2B environment, and it can get quite precise actually. The output then, once you've mapped these preferences and you start, let's say, modeling, which customers would want to buy coffee and donuts and which customers would want to buy burgers, sodas, and fries, and how much they want to buy them, you start to get these rankings of features. And obviously, as this slide shows, you can throw in your existing features, but also the features that you're thinking about building, so your roadmap features, and obviously also the competitive features in case you're wondering. And so competitive features doesn't necessarily have to be only the functional features in your competitor's product, which is usually what product departments tend to survey for, but it can especially also be the service and transactional features that your customers are using to sell to the customers. So it could be something like specific terms and conditions that they're using, or it could be something like payment plans, or it could be something like you come up with the next. Okay. And obviously doing an analysis like this, you'd come with, to some kind of realization that some of the features that you surveyed probably aren't that valuable. And if they're already in the product, then, well, okay, so maybe they are. But if you haven't built them yet and customers actually don't seem to want it, then maybe they should at least take a backseat in your development efforts. So this kind of, let's say, overview, you can obviously also run on a segmentation basis. So you can say, well, let's have different customers. Essentially, you use a clustering analysis or a factor analysis, and you use some regression analysis in order to sort of come up with these segmentations. But this is essentially an overview of how a mixed diff analysis would work. And the easiest thing for you is to essentially just, well, write me an email and ask, or simply just Google it and you can come up with it. The output of the AI processes is a little, let's say, different visually, but essentially it yields the same result. And essentially it says who wants what and how badly. And if we do the process, let's say, disciplined enough, we're actually able to attach a dollar or euro value to each feature for each particular customer, especially in combination with other features. And that's what is allowing us to actually build the packaging and the pricing from the bottom up, from the individual feature levels and up. So once we've done this, we then use that value ranking and we come up with some hypotheses. And we're saying, okay, so the new packaging might look like this. So what the result was here for Icon Finder was that we figured out that one of the transactional features that didn't have a lot of value to the customers, but had a very high hygiene factor, so which allowed them to buy. It wasn't something that they were demanding in the market, like actively searching for, but if it wasn't there, they couldn't buy. That was the commercial licenses attached to the icons. So designers specifically needed commercial license, but they also needed to be able to pass that commercial license on to their customers. So they needed their customers to be able to use the icon commercially. The other customer groups, especially people either wanting the commercial license for themselves only, or customers who didn't want a commercial license at all because maybe they were just using it for internal PowerPoint presentations or something like that. So we could really distinguish between different customers. So we could use these hygiene features to screen or place customers into specific product tiers. And essentially this was sort of one of the hypothesis examples that we came up with and used to sort of validate across customers, saying, okay, so how about we do this? And it worked really beautifully in placing these different, let's say, categories of customers they have in each of these product tiers. So once you have this hypothesis, you move on to the validation phase. And usually we create some form of a Sankey diagram, which is what you see here on the right. And essentially it's saying, well, if you have the existing bundles or packages, you have those on the left-hand side, the pay-as-you-go, the tier 1, the tier 2, the tier 3. And then we move them over. In this example, we just have 3 tiers on the right-hand side, or 3 new tiers. We say, of all the ones in the pay-as-you-go model, where do they go? How many of them move to tier 1, how many to tier 2, and how many to tier 3, and so on and so forth. And obviously, it's actually not here in this model, but obviously you'd also have churn in there as well, saying, okay, how many actually don't buy anything at all? They leave us when we push this new product packaging as well. And you can validate I have 4 suggestions for you here, and we usually rank them. So you can validate using past data. That's essentially the machine learning and AI process that will predict how customers behave in let's say, new value propositions. You can ask them, surveys, interviews, pilots, and so on. Or you can run a sales test. And we usually run sales tests at 2 levels, either to ask new customers or to ask legacy customers. And the theory is, if you can sell a new product packaging to new customers, then you ought to be able to impose it or sell it to existing customers as well. Okay, so that was the step. So deconstruct your capability into possible features, functional, service, transactional, describe these features. So for example, the motivational capability and so on, map customers' preferences onto these features, build your packaging hypothesis on the value proposition using all the functional, service, and transactional features, validate it with customers. If they're super happy, implement. If they're not and have feedback for you, update your customer feature preferences, build new hypothesis, and run to validation again. So for Icon Finder, this was a good move because the rollover icon credits alone reduced their churn to almost nothing. So with this reduced churn, every new sale that they got in was pure sort of increase in monthly recurring revenue, which turned a money-losing business into break-even in just 6 weeks. So it was really sort of a silver bullet for them. We also used some of the other findings from surveys, especially across expectation to pay, which was actually something I mentioned last time in the pricing model survey, to change around their cost structure, especially on design commissions, which raised their gross margin by a factor 3 almost. So in the end, when they implemented these 2 things, they actually stayed with a relatively simple package. So the first packaging that you saw is actually very similar to what they have today, but they used the feature preference surveys we have to actually guide the roadmap going forward. So they got a lot out of it. And Martin, in the end, got to keep his majority in the company and is sort of a pretty happy camper now. Okay, so this was sort of the first big run. I know this was sort of an hour of me talking to you about how to build these value propositions, but essentially, let's run through the concepts again. So how do we build the value proposition from the ground up using fencing first? Then we use jobs to be done, and then we use bottom-upping. That's sort of the most sort of important elements that you can use in actually creating these value propositions. So I'll just pause a few minutes for questions, and I'll take a look at the chat just in case that some of you asked them while we've been at it. So let's see here. Dan asks, what was the result of the German logistics OEM? Did they sell more with the new packaging? I don't know, Dan, because I actually had the workshop yesterday. So it's very new. So they haven't implemented it yet. They were, I think they were pretty happy with the input so far, but we'll have to see. And essentially, it's one of the things that you can usually, the first tests you can make is if you have new packaging and it makes sense both to your product team and to your sales team, that's usually a pretty good sign. So if these 2 departments can actually connect on a specific packaging, that's usually good. Okay. Okay, so maybe you're, caught a little bit by surprise by the question session, because that was actually the only question right now. So I'll just continue with the next segment, and if you have questions, just ask them in the chat, and I'll get to them. Okay, so expansion journey. This is where the 4th concept comes in, laddering. So the expansion journey is essentially, how do we design our product so that we have a good balance between what the customer buys on day 1 and the possible upsells and and increased revenues we get from that customer over time. So the idea here is that we have to order these different packages inside a fence to maximize customer profitability across the customer lifetime. And again, it's not optimizing revenue, it's optimizing the relationship between revenue and the acquisition cost. And essentially, I usually we build a storyline on axis that it runs across. And one of the key elements is actually to design your product and your processes, also your pricing, in order to reduce the customer acquisition cost. I just want to sort of show you sort of very basically how I think that sort of works. So let's say you have a product and pricing model, and you have your sales team and marketing and so on, all the new biz team over in your acquisition model, and you have your customer success and so on in your service model. So the first thing that happens is that a customer then comes in as a new biz sale. So they buy your product through your pricing model. And then once that customer is then, happily using your product, then it's usually up to your customer success team and your account managers to promote the expansion sales. Also, if you have a well-designed product and pricing model, this should happen. The product should sort of sell itself. There should be a design principle going on where the product is sort of easily expandable into either adding new modules, adding new volume to the existing sales, and the pricing model shouldn't inhibit this. So it's one of the things especially with the companies transitioning from on-prem to cloud, because usually on-prem, because of the sales and revenue model in on-prem software, have very skilled and expensive sales teams, direct sales teams that are selling their existing software. So what we see is that these expensive and skilled sales teams are then applied to the SaaS business model, which isn't necessarily a particularly good idea, because that means that you now have acquisition cost every month for the entire customer's lifetime. You're constantly trying to sell to the customer, and what you're using is relatively expensive personnel or people to do that. And essentially what we usually do is we run this formula. So we're saying there are 4 steps in doing the expansion sale. First is asking yourself, how would the customer know that there is something else for sale? 2, how will the customer, that's a call to action, how will the customer be prompted to expand? So what's actually the reason for them to do this expansion? 3, how will the customer actually sort of in a very practical way buy the expansion? Do they call in? Do they click a button? What happens? And 4th, how will the customer actually adopt the new functionality? Or is it something the software does on its own, or does it require you to come and deliver a training session or actually implement something in the customer's organization, so on and so forth. And essentially you can run this little fraction at the bottom, but essentially what it says is that if you spend a lot of money on 1 and 2, that's probably not a good idea. 1 and 2, the knowledge and the call to action, probably should be automated. Probably. And if you take a look at the German logistics company again, we can see that the way that they had first envisioned their product packaging was essentially something like, well, we have on-site sales teams and we have managed services and so on, and we're going to essentially sell them Describe. And then once they're happy with Describe, we're going to tell them that we have Diagnose, and we're going to ask them to buy Diagnose. So that's a handheld process of this 1 and 2. And then if they buy Diagnose, we're happy. We're then going to onboard them also manually to using Diagnose. And then at some point, we're going to tell them the Predict Assist and so on and so forth. So what they're doing here is just a very manual process in order to actually get the customer from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. So it's handheld, high cost, customer acquisition cost, all the way through the expansion journey of the customer. If we then look at the example that we came up with here, we see, okay, So if we have something like maintenance, and we actually run maintenance really well, and we have several, let's say, levels of sophistication within maintenance, so all the way from describe to prescribe, what's going to happen once this logistics facility that they're installed in actually suddenly has maintenance all over control? Well, maybe we can build in some simple grayed out operational dashboards, or simply a tab in the software that says operations, and when you click it, it says, well, we have an operations suite, contact your sales manager to get access. So it's easier for us. You could presumably do this in this version of the software as well. But the way it usually turns out is that it's easier for us to explain what you'll get in the operations if we'd already solved a complete job in maintenance than it is to explain exactly what is the difference between predict and prescribe. So essentially you can say different kinds of packaging can lend itself to different kinds of expansion journeys and different kinds of automations on this level. Okay. So I usually ask this question when we're doing laddering, and it is, if you solve this first job for my customer, if you solve the predictive maintenance job, for example, what job will now become most pressing? And essentially, you can see like the customers have a certain bandwidth. And if they are so preoccupied with solving the maintenance problem, they aren't yet concerned with the operations problem to the same degree. But if you solve that first one for them, maybe they'll shift their focus and say, well, the highest value problem we have right now is actually operational excellence. So, can you help us with that? And yes, we can. So that's maybe the key sort of concept for laddering. Okay. So the next two segments on driving the roadmap and so on are quite a lot faster. So I'll just check in again before we start if there are any questions on this first bit here. You're not in question mode today. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I'll just continue, and we can take. I'll check in every now and again on the questions. Okay, so driving the roadmap. So let's say that you've come up with this packaging. You've done the fencing, the segmentation. You've considered the jobs to be done. You've done your breaking down and building up of the value propositions through the bottom-up process. And you've even sort of aligned everything to enable low-cost sales all through the customer's lifetime. Okay, the next thing that happens is that your product department or your engineers come up with a new feature. So they say, well, we have this new feature A, and we'd like you to sell it. So, if you just created something that is beautiful and it's sort of perfectly aligned with the value propositions, then a new feature can pose a problem because suddenly it has to fit in somewhere. And what do you do with it? So in this scenario, we can put this new feature lots of places in our packaging. We could put it inside an existing tier or package. We can put it as a new tier. So we can say, well, if you want this feature, we're going to force you to buy everything else and then this new one, or we can place it sort of as an optional add-on to all the other things, so as an add-on or as a module. And the real question here is, so where does it actually optimize what you're trying to do? And the principles are, even if it's new and high tech and you're excited about it, don't be tempted to place it in some new high-tech tier that isn't, if that high-tech tier isn't addressing a very specific customer job or problem. If the new feature is actually addressing a customer job or problem that you're already solving in one of your existing packages, place the feature there. Which leads us to principle 2. Then you should, as a general rule, monetize this feature or this new product development through price increases, not unbundling. So unbundling is placing the feature in its own tier or is it in its own add-on. If you can monetize it just by placing it into an existing tier where it fits better conceptually. Do that, even though you'll then have to go through the trouble of raising prices. Because run this process 25 times with 25 new incredible features. What you're going to end up with is a mess of a product. You're going to have 25 new high-tech add-ons, and you're never going to get around to actually repackage them again and make sense of everything. So it's just a good sort of due diligence process to actually package it sort of as you go along where it belongs, and then just raising prices as the value of your product increases. So this then has, the third principle here is that it has actually sort of a forward-facing impact on your product roadmap, is that you shouldn't build features to actually create the product or make the product stronger. You should actually build features with a particular value proposition or packaging in mind. You should be able to say, well, if we build this feature, exactly how in our product and pricing model is this feature going to fit in? How are we going to sell it? Where can we increase prices as a result of this feature? Or if it really is a new tier or a new module, who will buy it and for what price? So essentially you run the same kind of Sankey diagram as we showed before in the bottom-upping process, and you say, well, you know, when we plan a new feature, we should know how that changes things. And if we know how that changes things, we should be able to put a value on that feature, you know, dollar sales value or an increase in customer spend. And by that metric, we can compare all the features and we can say, well, if what we want to do is increase revenue, which features should we build? Okay. So if you've done this, then how do you raise prices? And most enterprise software contracts have some sort of inflation adjusted pricing attached to it. So here I just have a 5-year like template of a price schedule. And let's say that you started at index 100, and then after 1 year you have 1% of inflation. But let's say that you also determine that you have a 5% increase in the product value through the new features and the development that you've done. Then I'd say you should, you know, if your competitive environment hasn't changed, raise your prices 6% to index 106. Next year, you should do the same thing. You should raise your prices to match the inflation and the value increase to, in this example, 114. If you mess up your product development, or maybe you fall a little behind your competition, and you actually say, well, even though we had inflation this year, we feel that we're at a worse position value-wise than we were last year, then through different means, maybe even larger discounts, or through changing something like the granularity on your pricing metrics or some other versions, you can actually lower prices a little bit. And you can say, well, we're scaling back a little bit. And the next year, when you're suddenly, you know, hitting a gold mine of features, you scale back up, and so on and so forth. So if you have customers that are, you know, not want to sign on to this, they want grace periods, we usually create a structure like this. And here I've just created an example schedule where a customer gets a 3-year grace period. So we're saying, well, we're going to not raise prices other than inflation for the first 3 years, and then, you know, and then we will usually give you the optionality of actually canceling your subscription whenever you'd like. But we also get the optionality of actually increasing prices according to the value that we think we deliver. And then you get something like this. So this is usually one of the places where people who are used to tying their customers to long-term contracts get a little worried. And part of that is you're worried about two things. You're worried about, well, we'll lose the customer if we're not tying them with contracts. And two is, well, can we actually raise the prices in this way? And I just want to remind you of this slide that I showed you last week, which is the difference in value per customer, so revenue per customer, when you're comparing how often different software as a service companies actually change their pricing. And the red one at the top is updating prices every quarter. It doesn't necessarily mean raising prices. It can actually also mean decreasing them, but it can also mean, let's say, changing around some features in different ways, or it can mean something like changing granularity or some of the metrics and so on and so forth, changing your discounts, etc. But having this constant focus on calibrating or adjusting your pricing and product model is what gets you that. And notice that the next one there, the one that only on a 5-year period gets a 60% revenue increase on a customer basis and not 115%, is the ones that actually updated biannually, so twice a year. So if you're updating it twice a year and you feel that you're doing a pretty good job of that, just know that over a 5-year period, you actually have a 50% extra increase to reach if you go to do it quarterly instead of twice a year. So it's dramatic. And especially because with SaaS, it compounds over time. So this relatively schematic model, I just took a customer example that I'll just input it in the slide so you can sort of study how this might look, but this is actually sort of a scheduled example that we used here. So the last thing in these models that we need to notice is how to actually run the contract structure. And I'll just input this slide as well. You can ask me questions about it on email, but essentially it's in order to actually change your pricing and change the, let's say, what the customer is buying. You need a legal structure that actually is flexible enough for you to be able to, well, legally change the prices without renegotiating the core contract every quarter. So we have some suggestions for how you do that. So last, a few example pricing projects. But just before I show you those, I just want again to click and look if there are any questions. Okay, now we have a few. Rickard asks, how do you determine which method to use for what products, and do you triangulate the different methods? I'm not quite sure particularly what you're asking about, Rickard. So if you can just, let's say, give me a little bit more direction on what methods, where in the presentation are we on this? And then Labat says that the chat didn't work until you rejoined, so maybe that's why people aren't asking questions. Well, maybe. So, okay, then I hope that you can at least hear me and that you will just ask the questions on email. I'd be happy to do that. If so, okay, so that might be why we don't have any questions. It's because we have a little technical hiccup here. And then Lucas asks, would you rather do a bad fencing that is jumpable than do no fencing at all? I'd never do something bad, but then you'd have to resort to something else. And essentially, if you can remember this slide here from Icon Finder, essentially, if you remember what we did here with the commercial licenses, we created we identified features that were critical for very specific kinds of customers, and we used that sometimes we actually call this indirect fencing. But you can also call it screening customers or placing customers into specific product tiers. And I think if you don't have a very clear fence, so you, instead of opting for sort of a jumpable fence or a sort of awkward fence, try to use these sort of customer hygiene preferences instead on different features. So we call them screener features as well sometimes. So I think that would be sort of a better avenue for you instead of the sort of poor fencing. Okay, and yeah, so Rickard, just restate the question and we'll get back to it. So okay, so the last thing I want to show you is, and we have sort of half an hour left, is actually a few pricing projects. So a few examples of how these can run. And so this is pretty intense, right? So I've given you 6 hours total of talking to you on these first, let's say on a maybe overall organizational or strategic level, if you're an on-prem to cloud candidate. Then on the pricing, all the way from overall, let's say, conceptualization about pricing your customer, not your product, then going on to sort of looking at pricing architecture elements, pricing metrics, doing the whole wallet structuring exercise. Let's fitting this to the distinction between what is valuable to customers, what do they expect to pay for, using that to get at the different customers' budgets, and running it all across these, let's say, levels of complexities for how you create these pricing architectures. And now we add yet another level of complexity to how you build these value propositions, which is, well, start by sorting your customers into these fences or value-based segments, then identify these jobs that they have, so problems with demands attached to them, then break down your capabilities, functional, service, and transactional, and build it back up to actually meet these jobs. Think about how you're going to sell this at a low cost over time, so how the expansion journey is going to run. And then finally, expect to do this all over again every single quarter for the rest of the time that you're in business, right? That's essentially what I've been telling you for the last, 3 webinars. And so while it might not be super clear at this point, actually, I believe that it's quite easy. So but it does require you, wherever you are in your organization, to take a step back together with people from the other functions. Maybe you're in product, then take someone from sales and take someone from finance, and sit down at arm's length and sort of reevaluate what you're bringing to the market. Take a look at it from the customer's perspective, and then run through these different concepts that I've tried to give you in these 2 webinars. And I think you'll get pretty far. So I quite often get contacted after these webinars with people who've spent a couple of workshop days in their team and say, well, we tried to use your concepts and we came up with this thing. What do you think about it? And more often than not, they're actually quite far. They are really, in a few days, applying these principles. You can actually get at something that is far easier to sell and will monetize far better than whatever it is that you have right now. So I'll invite you to do that. And then even doing that just once is going to be well worth the effort. But of course, doing it continually and actually building a competence around it is going to be quite valuable as well. And I just want to show you just a few high-level examples of how we've done. So, and these are a couple of cases where I have a little bit more. I'm permitted to talk a little bit deeper about them. So, the first one is ScalePoint Technologies. So I got introduced through the chairman of the board because I'd worked on one of the other businesses where he was chairman, and I worked closely with their COO, who actually, while this project was taking on, he transitioned and essentially took on the new role as chief sales officer, building their sales department because they hadn't had a sales department before. And what ScalePoint Technologies does is that they provide enterprise software to insurance companies. And especially they do it within the field of claims management and handling. So it's whenever let's say you drive in your car and maybe you get a stone on the windshield, the entire process of contacting your insurance companies, getting to a repair shop, getting the invoice, sending it back, getting the money, all these let's say workflows is what ScalePoint Technologies provides to the insurance companies. And they turn over maybe 100 million euros a year, and they have customers in Denmark, Norway, Sweden. They are expanding into Germany, and they do this 100 million worth of business on less than 30 customers. So it's so the average customer value is is more than 3 million euros. So it's high value contracts. And they have two overall products, and one of the products, which was a claims management tool called Easy Claims, they developed it 8 years ago. First, because a customer had contacted them and asked them to develop such a project, and they hadn't actually increased prices on this project for these 8 years. They just tried to sell it to as many customers as they could, and they had gotten a dozen or 2 dozen customers on, and they had the sense that they were underpricing quite heavily, and they were large contracts, so it wasn't so easy. So essentially, they said, well, given all the free professional services, because they were delivering quite a lot of free development and customization to these customers, and they had sort of on-site customer managers, and they said, well, overall the gross margin for this product is around 60% for us, and we'd really like it to go to 90%. And if you do the math on the price increase, that's a big price increase, and we'd like to do this without losing any of the existing customers. So we have maybe these 2 dozen customers, and we'd like to roll this pricing out without losing a single one of them, because they're quite high value. So the way we did this was to first create quite a comprehensive cost overview. So we took all of they had Azure as well, but they also had other IT infrastructure actually powering the solution. So we created what we call the bottom-up cost overview, saying, okay, for each of the things you're delivering to your customer, where are the cost drivers? Where's the headcount? Where's the phone calls? Where's the SQL servers? What's the Azure cost? What kind of third-party licenses do we have? What kind of step functions do we have in these pricings? What would happen to these prices if we double, tripled, quintupled the volume, so on and so forth? And then we essentially sort of created an overview that allowed us to actually calculate these margins on each of these value propositions if they were to be sold. And then we, instead of doing a lot of work with mapping customer preferences, we did some of that, but we only talked to maybe 5 customers in this process. But we spent a lot of time actually starting to map their budgets, and we started to spend a lot of time mapping the customer's expectation to pay, especially across a lot of internal stakeholders. So we talked to the chief of claims management, which was their primary buyer, but also to the chief technology officer, to their compliance department, to their procurement department, and so on and so forth. And we sort of got an idea about, okay, and we asked questions like, how would you account for this? Like, how would this cost appear in your bookkeeping? And what are we competing with in this budget category? And we have different questions, and you can run the max diff and well of these. And then we redesigned the pricing architecture to essentially target these different budgets as well. So their primary buyer, the person responsible for the claims management process, actually was at his maximum capacity. So we couldn't make the price per claim, which was the current pricing model, we couldn't make the individual claim more expensive, because then the economics of the single claim would become too expensive for their primary buyer, the claims chief. So instead, what we did was we simply added additional things to price. We just added storage, API calls, test environments on the server. We did quite a bit of work on expanding and professionalizing the commercial structure around their professional services and their, let's say, the development projects they were doing for customers, and so on and so forth. So we essentially sort of created these different revenue avenues for the customers. And then we went through some validation processes, first internally across all the stakeholders and different P&L centers that they had. And then powered by this COO, now turned CSO, we ran a test sales period on first acquiring 2 new customers on this pricing scheme, where we actually had updated the pricing to this new level. So it was something like, we achieved actually a 90% gross margin on this product in the end. And once we had done that with these 2 new customers, we had the confidence that if we could convince a customer that hadn't sort of pre-invested in the platform to buy at these prices, then we should be able to actually roll this onto legacy customers. And we did that. And so they haven't rolled over all the contracts yet, but they have rolled over maybe half of them. And they have done so with so far not losing a single one of these enterprise customers. So it's sort of a step-by-step approach to sort of figuring out what exactly can the customer pay for, and on a budget basis, what is the customer used to pay for, and how could we actually map this onto both our existing costs, and are there some of these costs that we can actually pass on to the customer? And maybe if we do it in a very transparent way, they will actually accept it. They will think it is fair. They will have a high degree of expectation to pay for these items, such as storage, API calls, and so forth. And this was sort of the driving concept behind this exercise for this particular customer. So part of it also actually was to redesign their entire contract framework and designing a commercial framework for their negotiations and their discount giving and sales, especially through their customer success division as well. Okay, so that's one case and a sort of one example of how this process can work. And I have one more case for you. So let's see if we can go to that one. So this is a startup, so it's a growth company, but it's a startup in the sense that they are maybe 70, 80 people or so. So it isn't sort of, they're past sort of it's a growth company, you say. And they had gotten, it's called contractbook.com, and they are a contract management system. And they're sort of on the top 10 global legal tech startups to watch. And just this last November, they got a quite large, for a venture capital round, 3 million euro capital investment in order to grow their top line, their annual recurring revenue, quite aggressively. So they were being asked essentially to scale their sales model and get new customers fast. And the idea was that in 2 years' time, they were to hit a quite high aggressive sales target. And if they could do that, they were sort of implicitly promised another financing round, a Series A round, and they could go on to do this. Okay, so the problem that ContractBook had, however, was that they had relatively high sales costs. So they had they had a combination of inbound and outbound sales, and the problem was that the sales were too expensive compared to the revenue or the annual contract value that the customer actually brought in. So you know, maybe they spent $1 in sales and they would get $5 in customer revenue, and that relationship wasn't big enough. So essentially, we were asked to look over their pricing and product models and to increase the average or the annual contract value by at least 60%. So essentially increase pricing by 60% without increasing the sales cost, which essentially means, well, it has to be as easy to sell as it is now, just 60% more expensive. And this was sort of, so this was the target. We had different, let's say, placeholders on churn as well, so we couldn't just lose a lot of customers, but essentially that was sort of baked into the customer acquisition cost as well. So this was a more traditional methodology we used. So essentially we said, okay, so we're going to map all the feature preferences of the customers, and they had pretty good segmentation in place already. So they had lawyers as sort of one fence and essentially everyone else as another fence, and that worked out pretty well for them. And then we used that basis to redesign the product model because it turned out that it was relatively complex for their salespeople to explain how to buy their product. Like they had some add-ons and some different user categories, and they had like an admin user and an expert user and a non-expert user. And their sales force were spending a lot of time explaining this to customers. Like, okay, and the customers were spending a lot of time thinking about what actually to buy. And this was a big obstacle for their sales, especially as the value wasn't that big. Also, we saw that the expansion sales was hurting because customers weren't easily arriving at the conclusion that they needed to buy more users. So usually they would, in the first sale, buy whatever users they were thinking that they would need, and they would never upgrade. So we redesigned this model to being quite a lot easier to have large. So we sold users instead of as individual users in quite large chunks. And then we differentiated on a different, instead of differentiating the features on the user type, then we just created a tiered model for them. And we then pushed this, let's say, simplified pricing and packaging model through a pre-sales period of 2 months. So going through January, February, and showcased that this would actually increase their account value by not only 60%, but actually by 85%, and with only a very, very small drop in lower conversion rate. And so it was a sort of net gain of almost 80% in customer lifetime value. And they implemented it this March and pushed it to all legacy customers 1st of April, and saw a 5% net churn based on that. So with this relatively simple process over maybe a total of 3 or 4 months, we actually enabled them to, with this 6 months of sales as well, to hit the annual recurring revenue target, so the turnover target that they had otherwise been given 2 years to reach in the financing round. So it was just a huge unlocking of value that was just sitting in their existing product and operations if they just had taken the time to essentially twist the product around in a way that was just much easier for sales to push into the market. And then when they had done that, increasing pricing on this wasn't actually that big problem. A big driver on the price increase was actually forcing the upsell in the number of users that the customers were forced to take. But customers actually accepted it because the smaller brackets was something like 5 users. So this is sort of 2 of the ways where I just wanted to sort of showcase how alike these projects actually are. So on one end, we have a relatively small startup, aggressively growing in the market, and worried about scaling up a sales model radically. And on the other hand, we have sort of a legacy software enterprise with very, very high value accounts, essentially where we do the same kind of mapping and progression through a process to redesign packaging, to redesign pricing models, and to validate it with their customers through test sale periods. We could use other methods as well, but that was the case in both of these. And it actually delivered as expected. So, and I think, hopefully, with the slide decks and the recordings of these webinars, that it shouldn't be too far-fetched for you to actually start something similar. And the last thing I want to show you is just a sort of a sketch model that we often use to sort of to start off project planning on these pricing and packaging projects. So essentially, it just showcases. So this is one of our sales slides, but use it just as your own sort of planning tool, and it shows just like sort of what steps actually are necessary in order to go from goal setting. So this is what we want out of our pricing strategy, all the way through, let's say, the being ready to implement, and essentially it's gathering data, figuring out what your costs are, talking to customers, running through jobs to be done, running through customer segmentation, preferences, pricing structure, product structure, and so on and so forth, until you are ready to validate, and then move into, let's say, the last step, pricing function, which is essentially doing it all over again on a continual basis. So my goal has been for you to at least start to do some of these things, and maybe even take a crack at running an entire process like this on your own, in your own organizations. So I hope in the last 3 webinars that I've sort of enabled that to some extent. And of course, lastly, we need to have some questions. Oh yeah, so I put this last slide in. After the last webinar, I wrote you that just as after the webinar I held in November, that if you want to book me for a review workshop or something like that, you're welcome to do so. I have 2 spots left on this side of August. So if you want me to help you this side of summer, not that you should, send me an email and I'll reserve one of the 2 spots for you. Okay, but that was sort of the last bit. Okay, now questions, and we have sort of 5 minutes. So let's see if we have some questions in the chat here. So Martin asks, doesn't changing pricing every 3 months put you in risk of scaring customers away if they can't predict their costs? Okay, so let's expand what price changes actually mean. So let's say that obviously, if you have a very simple product model and you have a very simple pricing model, if you change that every 3 months, it's going to, let's say, look more aggressive as compared to if you have a relatively complex pricing and product model. So usually what we do is we in a sort of an annual schedule, we put it into having product updates, and then we have pricing upgrades on, let's say, opposing ends of the year. So 2 product updates and 2 pricing updates every year. And you can do it by, let's say, something as simple as including a feature into a fence. That isn't going to make costs more unpredictable, but it can actually build up until a price increase that you do later, or maybe make you more competitive overall. It can also be introducing a new tier. It can be changing some of the granularity. So maybe you're saying, well, we're pushing the border of when you would go into a new price bracket or price tier, and so on and so forth. And you might also, of course, change the price points of some of on your storage, on your API calls, on your professional services, or so on and so forth. So I think this isn't about doing 5% overall price increases every quarter and then expecting your customers to not push back on you. This is about sort of calibrating constantly on all the different aspects of your model. It can even be something as simple as terms and conditions changes or definition changes in your contracts. So with that said, how do customers react to this? Well, obviously customers don't necessarily want price increases all the time, but it is part of the game. In lots of the enterprise software, we see that prices do change, and they also do change in sort of a flat percentage overall increase at least once a year. We see this in, let's say, Salesforce, for example. You can bet that Microsoft changes their Asia pricing, let's say on a global level, well, pretty much constantly, and so on and so forth. And it's not that you necessarily have this idea that your Microsoft costs are constantly changing, because your consumption of these Microsoft services are also constantly changing. So you rarely break it down to, well, what is exactly the average price we paid for a CPU core or a test server over the last 3 or 4 years. It's very rare that customers actually do this kind of calculations. So if you have a product model and you have a relationship with customers where they aren't negotiating fixed costs for fixed deliveries over long time frames, then you're actually able to power these price increases, as compared to this other model, which is pretty classical in a sort of a license plus maintenance way, where you say, well, we're selling it 5 million euros and then 1.25 million for 5 years or something like that. Then so part of what enables you to do these adjustments is essentially to moving to a more metric based and a more agile method of pricing overall. I hope that sort of answered the question, Martin. Okay, well, thank you.